audio lectures. So the first part we looked at the brain, and in this one, you guys will like this one because it's a little shorter. We're going to take a look at the spinal cord. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is basically you just want to remember that spinal cord is running from your brain all the way down through your whole vertebral column. And you want to remember that the vertebrae are, this is their main job and what they're kind of protecting. But I'm going to have this main spinal cord here, and then I'm going to have all these little branches. And you want to remember that the spinal cord up by your neck is the cervical. Okay, the middle part of your back is going to be your thoracic, and then the bottom part is going to be your lumbar. And at the very bottom, I'm going to get down towards the sacrum and things like that. But again, spinal cord, this is how all this information gets to the brain and how all these inputs and outputs get from the brain. Okay, and then here's a look at it, the actual spinal cord. And the main reason I kind of show you this is that, there's just so much going on, and it's kind of so delicate. And when you kind of take a look at this and you think about people who have back surgeries or neck surgeries or surgeries anywhere along their spine, you can see why they're so complicated. And each one of these little nerves is, delivering specific information, transmitting certain impulses. So it's hard to believe that they can kind of go in and try to fix part of this kind of without creating so much damage and scar tissue and things like that to sort of affect other areas. Okay, so you just want to remember that it's a really, really complicated kind of area, and it's one of those things that it's very, very difficult to kind of just get it under control once it starts to be an issue. And you want to think about the spinal cord. It's going to be surrounded by your whole vertebrae, right? And there's not going to be a ton of extra room in there. And this is kind of the bottom part of your spinal cord. So again, very, very delicate, and again, a little more fragile than people kind of think of sometimes. Okay, so now we get to the important part, especially for our labeling. We're going to have this spinal cord cross section. So this is as if you kind of cut the spinal cord and then kind of look down on it. So you're going to get these two grooves that are going to partially divide the spinal cord into this left and right halves. You're going to get a ventral median fissure. So here's where the ventral stuff and the dorsal stuff kind of comes back to haunt you a little bit. But again, ventral is anterior, dorsal median sulcus is going to be posterior. You're going to have the gray matter of the cord that's going to be kind of in the middle or in its core. And then you're going to have the white matter that's going to surround everything or be located on the outside. You're also going to have the central canal. It's going to run the length of the spinal cord, and this is going to be just this little opening that's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid, but it's going to allow me to get this fluid to all the parts of my spinal cord and keep everything really, really healthy. Okay, and this is a picture for this part of the chapter that you want to be really familiar with because it kind of has everything on there that I could ask you to kind of label. Okay, so we get my cord here, and you can see where we've just kind of cut it crosswise and we're looking down onto it. But I can see my gray matter, I can see my white matter, I can see my dorsal sulcus, okay, and I can see my ventral sulcus, and then I can see the nerves coming off, I can see the meninges, I can see a bunch of good things on here. And the one thing everybody kind of always asks is, how do I know what's the front and what's the back? And it's going to be this little ganglion here, okay, so the dorsal side of the spinal cord, or the nerve roots coming off of the dorsal side are going to have this little ganglion or this little bump, and this is going to be your sort of landmark that's going to help you know that, okay, this is dorsal, the other part's going to be ventral, and it's going to help you sort of label all the things correctly, okay? So just remember, when you're doing your labeling, the first thing you do is always orientate yourself. And with this one, if you don't have the spinous process or the vertebrae, you have to go by this little dorsal root ganglion or this little bump to kind of know that this is the dorsal side and this is the ventral side. Otherwise, it's really easy to kind of get everything wrong, okay? But we'll come back to this one. Here's a picture from the top. And again, we want to remember that the spinal cord is sort of surrounded by the vertebrae. And again, this picture is really important because I can see the roots coming off, but I realize that there's just not a ton of space in there. Okay, so any sort of inflammation, any disc, remember you're going to have a disc sitting on top of this vertebrae here. If the disc ruptures, if it's bulging, it can easily push back into the spinal cord or hit one of the nerve roots, and then I'm going to disrupt the ability of those nerves to kind of function properly. Okay, so really, really, really important just to remember that, that spinal cord is again a little more delicate than we might think. Okay, so now we get to the gray matter. And so in a cross section, the gray matter, and we already saw the picture of the spinal cord, is going to look like the letter H, or it's going to look like a butterfly. It consists of mirror image masses. They're going to be connected, okay, by this crossbar of gray matter. It's called the gray commissure. We'll see that again in the picture here. You're going to have two dorsal horns. That again, dorsal is going to be posterior. You're going to have two ventral horns, and those are going to be anterior. And what each of the horns is going to do for us is that it's going to kind of carry different information, some towards the brain, some down away from the brain, but that's what we want to kind of concentrate on this part of the chapter. Okay, the horns create columns of gray matter that run the entire length of the spinal cord, and then the thoracic and superior lumbar segments are also going to have these little lateral horns that are going to come out of there. Okay, but mostly just in that middle part of the back. And in this one, you can see that we have this little lateral horn here. So it kind of tells you this is coming from the thoracic or from the upper part of the lumbar. Okay, so again, I want to find my horns, right? So I know dorsal root ganglion. I know this is my dorsal horn, ventral horn, and then I get my little lateral horns. And now we're going to look at, okay, what type of input or impulses is each of these horns kind of doing for me? And again, this is where a lot of those multiple choice questions come from is, do I know, hey, if I have a damage to my dorsal horn, what sort of symptoms I'm going to have, or what is my body not going to be able to sort of do? So here is all the info here. So I have ventral horns. They're going to be my somatic, but the important thing to remember with the ventral is that it's all going to be motor stuff, okay? So body, motor, ventral horn, okay? My lateral horns, this one kind of makes sense because it's my autonomic organs, right? But the lateral horns are in that thoracic spine or in that middle part of the body, very close to all these organs, okay? So that one kind of makes sense. And then my dorsal horns, the way I always remember this is that dorsal has that S in there, and they're going to be all my sensory stuff, okay? But I'm going to have two different ones. I'm going to have somatic sensory neurons that are receiving input from my body, and then I'm going to have a separate set that are going to receive input from my organs, and that'll be my visceral sensory organs, okay? So the ventral roots, again, we want to be ventral, dorsal, what kind of information are they carrying? And these are the branches that are coming off of the spinal cord, and eventually they're going to turn into these nerves that go to all the different parts of my body. So ventral roots are somatic motor neurons. Again, they're efferent. Motor stuff is moving away from the brain, right? So it's efferent. So this is how I'm controlling all my effectors, right? My organs, my muscles. Send their axons out to the skeletal muscles or the effector organs. They're going to use these ventral rootlets. We'll come back to those in a picture here in a second. The rootlets are going to fuse together to form the ventral roots of the spinal cord. Okay, so remember I got to find dorsal ventral. So this is my dorsal root ganglion again. These are going to be my ventral roots here, and then again I'm finding these are my rootlets, and this is going to be that ventral root. Okay, and I can already see that they're going to fuse kind of with the dorsal side eventually too. Okay, dorsal roots, afferent, right, sensory, going up to the brain, so carrying impulses from the peripheral sensory receptors. They're going to form the dorsal roots of the spinal cord, just like the ventral side, and they're going to fan out into the rootlets before they enter the spinal cord. Okay, so we can't really see these ones too good, but they would be right over here. Rootlets, and then I get the little dorsal root, and again, the main landmark that we want to be aware of is that dorsal root ganglion so that we know the difference between one side and the other. Here's a picture from the top. And there's my little ganglion, and again I can see where these little rootlets here are going to run towards certain horns in my spinal cord. Okay, so now we have our spinal nerve. So the dorsal and ventral roots are going to be very short. We saw that in the picture. They're going to fuse laterally, so again they're going to come together to form our spinal nerves, and then they're going to go to every different little part of the body. Okay, so here's a picture of, this is a really good one, kind of gives you everything, where it shows you the spinal cord, it shows you the gray matter, it shows me all the horns, right? It shows how each root is going to combine to kind of form my spinal nerve. I can see my dorsal root ganglion, but it gives me these little pictures over here, which is, this is dorsal, so these are going to be sensory, right? So soma, body sensory, visceral motor, and then body motor, okay? So remember, the main thing you want to remember is that the ventral side is going to be motor, and the dorsal side is going to be sensory. Okay, so now we look at the white matter. So we looked at the gray matter. The white matter of the spinal cord is composed of both myelinated and non-myelinated fibers. They're allowing communication, okay, between different parts of the spinal cord and between the spinal cord and the brain. So now everything is kind of come in from the periphery. It's gotten to my spinal cord, and now I have to move it up my spinal cord and up to the brain, or I have to send impulses from my brain down the spinal cord out to the rest of the body. Okay, so the white matter is movement within the spinal cord and within that central nervous system. So fibers are going to run in three directions, and again, we already kind of know this a little bit. So ascending is always sensory, okay? Descending is always motor, and then we also have transverse, which we saw a little bit in the other chapter 2, but this is where I can move things from one side of the cord to the other, and these are going to be those commissural fibers that we saw, where, again, even in the brain, we can go from one hemisphere to the other or stay within the same hemisphere when we're kind of combining all this info. And then these ones, again, they're sending that information up to a specific part of the brain to be kind of analyzed depending on what sort of info they're kind of carrying. Okay, so we have these tracks. So ascending and descending tracks, again, made up mostly of white matter. Each tract is made up of axons with similar destinations and functions, okay? And they're usually going to be named according to their origin and their destination. So when you see this little picture here, and again, the information is coming in or it's moving out, but there's similar information. They're going up to specific parts of the brain or being sent from the brain to be kind of analyzed in the specific part that's going to sort of be able to interpret all those little impulses. Okay, so we get these little names here. We get the spinocerebellar, we get the spinal thalamic. I'm not going to ask you to name them or label them or anything like that. I just want to show you the picture just to show you the tracks and show you how things are sort of moving through that spinal cord. And again, the spinocerebellar, it tells you it's going from the spine to the cerebellum, right? Spinal thalamic, spine up to the thalamus. So again, the name, they're not super tricky, but the name is going to kind of tell you where it's going to, and then again, each of these tracks is going to kind of carry different information. Okay, but we're going to focus on just the main labeling. Okay, labeling the spinal cord. We're going to focus on the dorsal versus ventral and sort of what information is coming into each one. We're not going to worry too much about the tracks. Okay, so the last part of this one, we get into the spinal cord trauma and disorders. So spinal cord trauma, it's going to be a localized injury to the spinal cord or the roots. It's going to lead to functional losses. And again, this is where they can say, hey, you had an injury to the dorsal root. What sort of symptoms are you going to get? You're going to say, hey, those are sensory. Added damage to the ventral. It's going to be more motor stuff, okay? And we hear some of these terms here that we've all kind of come across, but we might not necessarily know exactly what they mean. So we hear this paresthesises, okay? You'll hear this maybe from your parents or your grandparents when they go to the doctor or they read a report or they do something like that. You'll hear these terms kind of come up. But this is damage to my dorsal roots, okay, or sensory tract. So anything that damages those dorsal roots, I'm going to get a loss of this sensory function, okay, because it's dorsal and that's where all the information from my senses is kind of coming through those dorsal nerves. Paralysis is a little different, okay. This is actually a loss of motor function, so your muscles are not going to work anymore. And again, this one's going to be caused by damage to those ventral roots or those ventral horn cells. Okay, so paresthesis is sensory, paralysis is going to be a motor functional loss. And again, you can have both at the same time depending on how bad the injury is, or different diseases will sort of attack different parts of the spinal cord. Okay, if you get a transection, these are really scary. So transection of the spinal cord, or you can talk about, someone severs their spinal cord at any level, results in total motor and sensory loss in the regions inferior to the cut. So the way your spinal cord works is, when you get a transection or you sever your spinal cord, everything below that level is no longer going to work anymore because I can't get information to the brain and I can't get information down from the brain to that area any longer. So if you're a paraplegic, this is where you're going to have both lower limbs are affected. Okay, so this is going to be a transection kind of between T1 or thoracic and lumbar spine, but it's going to affect both of your lower limbs, so your whole lower body. Okay, quadriplegic is one that's up higher, transection of my cervical spine. Okay, and this is going to include, because it's up higher, it's going to include all 4 of your limbs. So this is, does a person still have use of their upper extremities, or do they have use of no extremities? Okay. This is one that always ended up on our test. This was on our boards test. Kind of every chiropractic test I ever took, they would always talk about this. C345 keeps the diaphragm alive. And this is kind of with head injuries. My little guy plays hockey, and one of the scariest things you can see in hockey is when a kid goes kind of sliding headfirst into the boards. But this is kind of basically telling you that if you sever that spinal cord, at this kind of level, C345, it's gonna determine whether you're still able to kind of breathe on your own, which obviously means, if you can't breathe on your own, even if you're still alive, you have to be hooked up to all the respirators and things like that just to be able to survive. Okay, so just a good one, just to kind of, because it rhymes basically, and it makes it easy to remember just in case it ever shows up on any of your exams. So here are some other kind of spinal cord disorders. Okay, so we get poliomyelitis. So these aren't injuries, these are more like diseases and things that kind of affect the spinal cord. So poliomyelitis, most people have heard of. My parents had this little scar kind of on the side of their arm when I was a kid where they had gotten their little polio shot. Not as common now. What I want you to remember from these two, and we're going to come back to these when we look at the disorders of the just nervous system in general, okay, is just know what horn they're sort of attacking and what sort of symptoms they're going to get. So poliomyelitis is going to be destruction of the ventral horn, and again, it's going to be motor stuff, okay? So muscle atrophy, death may occur from paralysis of your respiratory muscles or cardiac arrest. So remember, those heart muscles and your breathing muscles and all like that can be affected, even though, we think of them as more autonomic stuff, okay? But they're still muscles. Anything motor is going to be connected to those certain horns. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, otherwise known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. This one is a destruction of the ventral horn. Again, going to be motor neurons and fibers of that pyramidal tract. Okay, but again, ventral horn, motor. Symptoms include loss of ability to speak, swallow, breathe. Okay, this is a really, really bad one because people don't survive very long. Okay, so you can see from this one that a lot of these diseases you can kind of, you can live a good life and you can live for a really, really long period of time with multiple sclerosis or all these other diseases that we'll talk about in a little bit. This one is really, really tough, and a lot of it comes down to just this ability to kind of breathe. But death typically occurs within 5 years, which is really, really, really fast, and a lot of times they're going to deteriorate really, really quickly. So caused by environmental factors and these genetic mutations, and they don't quite understand exactly how it works, but it's something to do with this RNA sort of processing. Okay, so this is kind of one where people start going for tests for different sort of neurological symptoms. This is the one that you do not want to be diagnosed with, okay? Because a lot of those other things, they can go into remission, we can live for a long time, the symptoms can be not as severe. This one, again, the death is typically within that 5 years, and a lot of times it's even within 2 to 3 years. Okay, so the next thing we're going to move on to is a peripheral nervous system, and then we'll do our autonomic nervous system, and then we'll start moving into our endocrine system.